The lunchroom at Northwood Academy was a battlefield of social status, fought with designer handbags and quiet, cutting remarks. Ilara had learned the art of being invisible. It was a skill she had perfected over 2 years, a shield she carried with her through the long, echoing hallways. She would sit at a small table in the far corner, her back to the wall, and eat the simple lunch her mother packed for her each day. Today it was a cheese sandwich, an apple, and a small bottle of water. It was nourishing, practical, and a stark contrast to the colorful salads and expensive sushi boxes that surrounded her. She kept her head down, her long, dark hair falling like a curtain to hide her face. She focused on the book propped open next to her tray, an old, well-loved novel from the public library. The words were a gateway, a way to transport herself out of this room and into a world where things like the scuff on her left shoe or the slight fade of her school blazer didn't matter. But the gate was never fully closed. Then came Isabella's voice, sharp and clear as a ringing bell, cutting through the murmur of privileged conversations. "Oh, I just love the smell of cheap soap in the morning. Don't you girls? It's so authentic." A wave of giggles followed like little glass shards. It was meant for her, of course. Ilara didn't look up. She just focused on the apple in her hand, her knuckles turning white as she gripped it. She knew Isabella wasn't really talking about soap. She was talking about Ilara's mother, Maria, who was the head of the academy's cleaning staff. She was talking about the faint, clean scent of bleach and polish that sometimes clung to Ilara's clothes, a reminder of her mother's hard work that paid for this very scholarship. Another girl, whose name Ilara thought was Jessica, chimed in. "My father says the help should be invisible. It just ruins the whole aesthetic when you're reminded of, well, you know." More laughter. Ilara took a small, deliberate bite of her apple. The crunch was loud in her own ears. She counted to 10 in her head, a trick her mother had taught her. "Breathe me, Amor," Maria would say, her hands rough from work but her touch gentle. "They are just noise. You are the music." Ilara didn't feel like music right now. She felt like a single, discordant note in a symphony she was never meant to be a part of. Her scholarship to Northwood was a miracle. A fluke of academic excellence that had opened a door into a world she could only observe. Her mother, who had worked tirelessly for the school since before Ilara was born, had cried with pride when the acceptance letter came, but that pride was shadowed by a deep, unspoken fear. She knew what her daughter would face. She knew the whispers and the looks. It was one thing for Maria to clean the halls of Northwood. It was another thing entirely for her daughter to walk them as a student. The bell finally rang, a shrill sound that signaled escape. Ilara packed her things with practiced speed, sliding her book into her worn but sturdy backpack and slinging it over her shoulder. She kept her gaze fixed on the exit, weaving through the crowd of students who seemed to part for her like she was a ghost. They didn't bump into her. They simply flowed around her space, as if touching her might somehow tarnish their expensive clothes. She walked past the main common area, where a group of boys were laughing about a new car one of them had gotten for his birthday. She passed the girls' restroom, where the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the sound of gossip. Every corner of this school was a reminder that she didn't belong. Her uniform was the same, yes, but it didn't fit the same way. Theirs was crisp and new, while hers had been mended carefully at the cuffs. Their shoes were pristine leather. Hers were scuffed and polished until they shone, but the marks were still there. Like tiny scars telling a story, instead of heading for the main exit and the long bus ride home, Ilara turned down a quieter corridor. This part of the school was older, the floors made of creaking wood instead of gleaming marble. The air was cooler here, smelling of old books and floor wax. Her destination was at the very end of the hall, the school chapel. It was rarely used anymore, save for the occasional formal assembly or a quiet wedding on a weekend. Most students saw it as a boring, dusty relic. For Ilara, it was a sanctuary. She pushed the heavy wooden door open, the sound a soft groan in the silence, and slipped inside. The light inside was always beautiful. It filtered through the tall, stained glass windows, painting colorful patterns on the wooden pews and the stone floor. Dust motes danced in the beams of light like tiny, sparkling fairies. The air was still and peaceful, a world away from the noise and judgment of the lunchroom. Here, she didn't have to be invisible. Here, she could just be. Her eyes immediately found the object of her affection, an old grand piano that sat on a slightly raised platform at the front of the chapel. It was not a gleaming, perfect instrument. The black lacquer was a little dull in places, and if you looked closely, you could see a fine layer of dust on its lid. It was overlooked, neglected. It was just like her. Ilara walked up the aisle, her footsteps making no sound on the thick carpet. She ran her hand gently over the cool wood of the piano side, a small smile touching her lips for the first time all day. She pulled out the small, worn cloth she kept in her backpack and carefully wiped the keys, removing the day's thin layer of dust. It was a ritual, a moment of respect. Then she sat down on the bench. The worn velvet cushion was familiar under her. She placed her fingers on the keys, cool and smooth ivory. For a moment she just sat there, breathing in the silence, letting the peace of the room wash over her. She closed her eyes and then she began to play. The first note was a tentative whisper, a single sound that broke the silence with a gentle touch. But then her fingers began to move, and the quiet girl in the corner of the lunchroom disappeared. The music that flowed from the old piano was not simple or hesitant. It was a river of sound, powerful and complex. It was full of a longing and a passion that seemed impossible for a 16-year-old girl to feel. She had never had a formal lesson in her life. She had learned by watching old videos on the library computer, by reading books she'd borrowed, and by listening, always listening. The piano was her first language. More natural to her than the words she struggled to speak during the day, the melody filled the chapel, soaring up to the high, arched ceiling and bouncing off the stone walls. It was a story of sadness and hope, of feeling small but dreaming big. It was the sound of her soul, finally given a voice. In this room with this piano, she was not the maid's daughter. She was not the girl in the rags. She was a creator, a storyteller, a musician. And for these precious few moments each day, that was all that mattered. The world outside with its Isabellas and its cruel whispers could not touch her here. She was home. The music was her language. It was the one place where the words came easily, flowing from her mind through her heart and out of her fingertips. In the lunchroom, her tongue felt thick and useless, tied in knots by the fear of saying the wrong thing. But here, on this worn wooden bench, she was fluent. The melody she created was a conversation, first with the piano, and then with the empty, beautiful room. It started softly, a gentle question asked in the lower registers, a sound like a lonely voice calling out in the dark. The chapel seemed to listen, the dust motes stilling in the colored light. She wasn't playing a song she had read from a page. She couldn't afford the sheet music for the complicated pieces she loved, and the library selection was small and tattered. This was her own music, born from the feelings she stored up all day like treasures in a locked box. It was the sound of her loneliness, the sharp sting of Isabella's words, the heavy weight of feeling like an outsider. But it was also the sound of her hope, the quiet pride in her mother's tired smile, the dream of a life where she didn't have to be invisible. Her fingers began to move faster, dancing across the ivory keys. The quiet question of the opening melody grew into a passionate argument. A cascade of notes tumbled down the scale like water rushing over rocks in a hidden stream. It was the sound of her frustration, a storm of chords that filled the chapel with a powerful, echoing voice. Her body swayed with the music, her dark hair brushing against her shoulders. Her eyes were closed, shutting out the world so she could see the music more clearly. She wasn't thinking about the notes, about which finger went where. It was too deep for that. She was feeling them, pulling them from a place inside her she didn't fully understand. This gift, this strange and wonderful ability, was something she had stumbled upon, not something she was given. She remembered the first time she had ever seen a grand piano. She was 7 years old, and her mother was working an extra weekend job cleaning a community center. Ilara had sat quietly on the floor, coloring in a book, when a woman came in and began to play. The sound had stopped Ilara's hand mid-scribble. It was like magic. The music was happy and sad and exciting all at once. She had watched the woman's hands, a blur of motion, and felt a strange pull, a deep curiosity that felt like hunger. After that, she had become obsessed. She would find any excuse to be near a piano. At first, it was just pressing one key at a time, marveling at the sound. Then she tried to pick out the simple melodies of songs she heard on the radio. Her mother, seeing her fascination, had saved up for months to buy her a small, second-hand electronic keyboard. It was a simple thing with unweighted keys and a tinny sound, but to Ilara, it was the world. She would play it for hours in their small apartment, her mother humming along while she folded laundry in the next room. When she started at Northwood and discovered the chapel, it was like finding a holy grail. This was a real piano. The first time she had touched its keys, the vibration had traveled up her arms and straight into her heart. She knew she had to keep it a secret. This place was hers. Her learning became a secret mission. She used the library computers to watch old, grainy videos of the great pianists. She would pause the videos, trying to memorize the placement of their fingers, the way their wrists moved. She borrowed thick, boring books on music theory, spending hours deciphering the strange language of sharps and flats, of chords and progressions. It was hard work, but it never felt like a chore. It was like learning to read a secret code that only she could understand. The music in the chapel began to soften again. The angry storm of chords passed, leaving behind a melody that was full of a gentle sadness. It was a beautiful, haunting tune that spoke of longing. It was the sound of watching other girls her age laugh and talk about things she could never be a part of: vacations, new clothes, expensive cars. It was the sound of wanting to belong, but not knowing how. The notes hung in the air, shimmering like a heat haze. She played a final, delicate chord, and let the sound fade into silence until the only noise was her own soft breathing. She kept her eyes closed for a long moment, holding on to the peace the music had given her. It was like coming up for air after being underwater for a long time. The world outside the chapel walls, with all its sharp edges and cold stares, seemed far away. Slowly she opened her eyes. The colorful light from the stained glass window had shifted, painting a bright red streak across the floor. It was getting late. She knew she had to go home, had to face her homework and the quiet reality of her life. But for now she was filled with the music. What she didn't know was that she wasn't alone. Down the hall, an older man with kind eyes and a head of thick, white hair was locking up his classroom for the night. His name was Arthur Harrison, and he was the school's music teacher. He was a man who felt most at home with a score in his hand or the sound of an orchestra in his ears. He was tired, his mind already on the cup of tea and the book that awaited him at home. As he turned the key in the lock, he heard a sound dot. It was faint at first, just a few notes drifting through the old building's ventilation system. He stopped, his hand still on the key. He tilted his head, listening. It was a piano. Someone was playing the old chapel piano. But this wasn't the hesitant, fumbling sound of a student practicing their scales. This was something else. The melody was complex, full of a raw emotion that was startling to hear. He knew every student in the school music program, every one of their strengths and weaknesses. This level of playing, this depth of feeling, was beyond any of them. Curiosity, a feeling he didn't experience often anymore, began to bubble up inside him. He walked quietly down the corridor, his soft-soled shoes making no sound on the floor. The music grew louder as he approached the chapel, a river of sound pouring from under the heavy wooden door. He recognized the piece now, not from a famous composer, but from the unique, soul-stirring quality of it. It was original. Someone in his school was writing and playing music like this. He reached the door and found it was slightly ajar, leaving a sliver of darkness to peek through. He leaned forward, his heart beating a little faster. And then he saw her. It was the quiet girl, the scholarship student. He couldn't remember her name, he was ashamed to admit. He just remembered seeing her in the hallways, always with her head down, always alone. He had a vague memory of her being the daughter of one of the cleaning staff. He saw her worn shoes, her mended blazer. He saw the way the other students, the ones from wealthy families, seemed to look right through her dot, and now, here she was, transformed. Her back was to him, but he could see the passion in her posture, the way her whole body was invested in the music she was creating. Her hands moved across the keys with a confidence and a skill that was breathtaking. She wasn't just playing the piano. She was a part of it. The music was coming from her, an extension of her very soul. He watched, completely mesmerized, as the music swelled and then softened as it told a story of pain and beauty. He saw a single tear trace a path down her cheek as she played the final, haunting notes. Mr. Harrison stood frozen in the doorway, his hand resting on the wood. He felt like he was witnessing something sacred, something he wasn't supposed to see. This was her secret place, her private world. To step inside now, to announce his presence, would be to shatter it. It would be like walking into a dream and waking the dreamer. He saw the music end, saw her shoulders relax as the final note faded into the silence. He saw her sit there, still and peaceful in the colorful light. In that moment, Arthur Harrison understood. He understood the loneliness he had sometimes sensed in her, the quiet strength she carried. He understood that this girl, this invisible girl, was a prodigy. A raw, brilliant, once-in-a-generation talent hiding in plain sight. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he couldn't just walk away and pretend he hadn't seen this. But he also knew he couldn't reveal himself tonight. He needed to think. He needed a plan. He had to be careful not to scare her, not to frighten this beautiful, rare bird out of its nest. Slowly, silently, he backed away from the door. He turned and walked back down the hall, the memory of the music echoing in his mind. He wasn't tired anymore. He was wide awake, his mind racing with possibilities. The quiet girl was no longer a mystery. She was a discovery. And he, an old music teacher who thought he had seen it all, had just found the most important thing of his career. He had found her. The next day felt different. The silence in the chapel had been replaced by a new kind of silence in Ilara's mind. A space filled with the memory of being watched. She went through her day with a knot of anxiety in her stomach. Every time a teacher looked at her in class, she flinched, wondering if it was him. Who was he? What did he want? The secret she had guarded so carefully felt exposed, like a snail that had been poked from its shell. She ate her lunch in the corner as usual, but the apple tasted like cardboard. The words in her library book were just blurry shapes. Her sanctuary had been breached, and she didn't know where to go. She avoided the chapel after school. Instead, she took the long way to the bus stop, her head down, her backpack feeling heavier than usual. She was almost at the edge of the school grounds when a gentle voice stopped her. "Excuse me? Miss, could I have a moment?" Ilara turned, her heart pounding. It was him, the man from the doorway. Up close, he looked older than she'd thought, with a full head of white hair and a face lined with kindness. He was wearing a slightly worn tweed jacket, and his eyes were a soft, gentle blue. He wasn't looking at her with pity or judgment, but with a quiet, serious respect that she didn't know how to handle. "I'm Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I teach music here. I don't think we've officially met?" Ilara just nodded, not trusting her voice. Her mind was racing. He knows. He's going to make fun of me. He's going to tell everyone I've been sneaking into the chapel. He seemed to sense her fear. He took a small step back, giving her space. "I was locking up the other evening," he said, choosing his words carefully. "And I heard something truly beautiful. It's a rare thing, to hear music that is so honest. So real." Ilara felt her cheeks burn with shame. She wanted to run, to disappear. But there was something in his eyes that held her in place. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition. He wasn't looking at the maid's daughter. He was looking at the girl who made the music. "I've been teaching for a long time," Mr. Harrison continued, his gaze soft. "And I've learned that real talent isn't something you can learn from a book. It's something you're born with. It's a fire inside." He paused for a moment, letting the words sink in. "And you, young lady, have a fire." No one had ever spoken to her like this before. It was a strange and frightening feeling, like being suddenly thrust into a spotlight she never asked for. She finally found her voice, but it was just a whisper, I was just, messing around. He smiled a little, a warm, crinkly smile. No, you weren't. You were speaking a language most people can't even hear, and that is why I wanted to talk to you. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded brochure. He held it out to her, but didn't force her to take it. There's a competition. It's called the Young Virtuoso Showcase. It's for high school students from all over the region. The best of the best. Ilara stared at the brochure as if it were a snake. A competition? The thought was terrifying. Playing for herself in the quiet chapel was one thing. Playing on a stage in front of people? In front of judges? It was impossible. I can't, she said immediately, shaking her head. I can't do that. Why not? He asked, his tone genuinely curious. Because I'm not like them, she said, the words tumbling out in a rush. The other kids who do those things. They have real lessons. They have nice clothes. They have, everything. She looked down at her scuffed shoes, the familiar shame washing over her. I'm just a girl who plays an old piano. Mr. Harrison took a step closer. You are a musician, he said, his voice firm but kind. That's all that matters. The rest is just noise. This competition isn't about who has the fanciest dress or the most expensive piano. It's about the music. And your music. Your music deserves to be heard. He finally pushed the brochure gently into her hand. The winner gets a full scholarship to the summer music program at the conservatory. A real chance. Ilara looked down at the glossy paper. On the front was a picture of a grand piano under a bright spotlight. It looked like a different world. A world she could only dream of. A part of her, a small, desperate part, wanted to say yes. But the fear was a giant, cold hand squeezing her heart. What if she was terrible? What if they laughed at her? What if Isabella and her friends found out? Mr. Harrison seemed to read her mind. Listen to me, he said, his voice lowering. Your talent is a fact. It's not up for debate. It's like the color of your eyes or the way the sun rises in the morning. It just is. Let the world argue with it if they want. But don't you ever argue with it. His words were a key, turning a lock inside her she didn't even know was there. Your talent is a fact. It was the most powerful thing anyone had ever said to her. She looked up from the brochure and met his eyes. He believed in her. This man, this teacher who didn't even know her name a few days ago, believed in the music she made. The fear was still there, but now there was something else, too. A tiny, flickering spark of hope. She took a deep breath, the air shuddering in her chest. Okay, she whispered. I'll try. That okay changed everything. The next day, Mr. Harrison met her after school. He didn't take her to the main music rooms, which were bright and full of noisy students. He led her to a small, dusty office in the back of the auditorium. It smelled of old sheet music and coffee. From a drawer, he pulled out a small, brass key. This is for you, he said, placing it in her hand. The chapel. So you don't have to worry about anyone locking you out. It's your space. The key felt small and heavy in her palm, a solid promise. It was more than just a key. It was trust. It was validation. Over the next few weeks, a new routine began. Ilara would go to the chapel every day after school. Sometimes Mr. Harrison would join her. He didn't teach her in a strict, formal way. He was more like a guide. He brought her stacks of sheet music, pieces by composers she had only read about. Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Debussy. The paper was crisp and new, a stark contrast to her old, library-borrowed books. At first, she was intimidated by the complex notes on the page. But Mr. Harrison would sit beside her on the bench, pointing things out. See here? He'd say, his finger tracing a line of music. This part, it's not just loud. It's angry. Or maybe it's desperate. What do you think it should be? He wasn't telling her what to do. He was asking her what she felt. He was teaching her to trust her own instincts, to pour her own experiences into the notes. He was her unlikely champion, a quiet, white-haired man in a dusty office. fighting a battle for her that she didn't know how to fight for herself. He never once mentioned her family, her clothes, or her place in the school. He only saw the music, while Ilara was discovering a new world of sound and emotion. The rest of the school went on as if nothing had changed. In the lunchroom, Isabella and her friends held court, their laughter echoing off the walls. One day, the conversation turned to the upcoming showcase. "Oh God, the virtuoso thing," Isabella said, rolling her eyes as she poked at her salad. "My parents are making me go. It's going to be so boring. Just a bunch of nerds in glasses playing their violins." "I know, right?" One of her friends chimed in. "It's so lame. Who even cares? It's not like any of them are actually going to be famous. They should just stick to the chess club." They giggled, completely unaware that the girl they so often mocked for her worn shoes and her quiet presence was the very thing they were dismissing. They were clueless, living in a bubble of their own making, while just down the hall in a dusty, forgotten chapel, a true prodigy was preparing to shatter their world with nothing more than 88 keys and a heart full of music. Ilara, in her sanctuary, practiced harder than ever, the sound of her own passion drowning out the distant, meaningless noise of their laughter. She was no longer just playing for herself. She was playing for Mr. Harrison, for the scholarship, for the dream. And she was playing just a little bit for them. The night of the Young Virtuoso Showcase felt like stepping into a different world. The venue was not the school auditorium, but a grand concert hall in the heart of the city. The air inside was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and anticipation. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceiling, casting a warm, glittering light over a sea of velvet seats and polished wood. People dressed in silk and tuxedos mingled in the lobby, their voices a low, confident murmur. Ilara, standing near the entrance in her simple dress, felt like a single, out-of-place note in a perfectly composed symphony. The dress had been her mother's project. They had found it at a second-hand shop, a simple, elegant navy blue sheath that was slightly out of style, but beautifully made. Maria had spent 2 evenings altering it, her skilled hands carefully taking in the seams and hemming the length until it fit Ilara perfectly. As she'd worked, she hummed a soft tune, her eyes bright with a fierce pride that both warmed and terrified Ilara. "You look like a queen, mi amor," she had said, standing back to admire her work. But now, surrounded by designer labels and effortless grace, Ilara felt less like a queen and more like a girl playing dress-up. She found her seat in the back, as far from the stage as possible. She clutched the worn fabric of her program in her hands, her knuckles white. Around her, families chatted excitedly about their children. A father boasted about his daughter's rigorous practice schedule. A mother pointed out a critic from the local newspaper. Everyone seemed to belong here, to understand the secret code of this world of high art and high society. Ilara just felt lost. Then a familiar, sharp laugh cut through the polite chatter. It was Isabella. She had arrived with her parents, looking breathtaking in a cream-colored cocktail dress. Her family moved with an easy confidence, nodding to people they knew. They sat a few rows ahead of Ilara, close enough for her to hear their conversation. "I still don't understand why we have to be here," Isabella was saying in a loud whisper to her father. "It's going to be so dreadfully dull. All that scraping and thumping." Now, Isabella," her father replied smoothly. "It's important to support the arts, and it looks good for the family." Isabella sighed dramatically, flipping her glossy hair over her shoulder. "Fine, but if anyone plays a tuba, I'm leaving." Her friends giggled, and Ilara's stomach tightened into a painful knot. She shrank down in her seat, praying they wouldn't turn around and see her, backstage. The air was cooler, smelling of dust and old curtains. Contestants paced nervously, some stretching their fingers, others whispering to their teachers. Ilara found a small, quiet corner and tried to make herself invisible. The doubt that had been her constant companion for years came rushing back. What am I doing here?" A voice in her head screamed. These people have been training their whole lives. They have the best teachers, the best instruments. I'm just the maid's daughter who plays in a dusty chapel. Just as the panic began to rise in her chest, Mr. Harrison appeared. He didn't say much. He just walked over and stood beside her, a quiet, solid presence. "They're just people, Ilara," he said softly, his voice a calm anchor in the storm of her fear. "And the piano is just a piano. It doesn't care who you are or where you come from. It only cares about the truth. So go up there and tell it the truth." He gave her a small, encouraging nod and then walked away, leaving her with his simple, powerful words. The lights in the hall dimmed, and a hush fell over the audience. A well-dressed man walked onto the stage and welcomed everyone. The first few performers were incredible. A violinist played with fiery passion. A cellist brought the audience to tears with a haunting melody. Each one was better than the last, and with every performance, Ilara's heart sank a little lower. They were so polished, so professional. How could she possibly compete? Then the host was saying her name. "And now, performing next, we have Ilara, from Northwood Academy." There was a moment of silence, then a light, polite smattering of applause. It was the kind of applause you give when you don't know what else to do. As she walked onto the stage, she could feel the eyes of the entire audience on her. She heard a whisper from the direction of Isabella's row, a distinct "who." She didn't dare look, but she could feel Isabella's smirk like a physical touch. It was a look that said, "I told you this would be dull." She reached the grand piano. It was a sleek black monster gleaming under the bright lights. It looked much more intimidating than the gentle old instrument in the chapel. She sat down on the bench, the velvet cool against her legs. She placed her fingers on the keys, took a deep, shaky breath, and closed her eyes. She blocked out the lights, the hundreds of faces, the expectations. She imagined herself back in the quiet chapel, the colorful light from the stained glass windows warming her skin. She was not here to impress them. She was here to tell the truth, and then she began to play. The first notes were not soft or tentative. They were sharp, clear, and full of a quiet strength that immediately grabbed the hall's attention. The piece she had chosen was a fiery, technically demanding etude by Chopin. It was a piece that could easily sound like a technical exercise, but in Ilara's hands, it was a story. Her fingers, which had been trembling just moments before, were now sure and strong. They flew across the keys, a blur of motion that was both violent and graceful. The music was a storm. It was the sound of her anger at the cruel whispers, her frustration at being invisible, her fight against the world that had tried to put her in a box. The melody was a cry, a powerful, soaring voice that refused to be silenced. In the audience, the effect was immediate. The people who had been settling in for a boring performance were now leaning forward in their seats, completely captivated. The polite smiles on their faces were gone, replaced by looks of pure awe. Mr. Harrison, watching from the wings, allowed himself a small, proud smile. He knew this was in her, but to see it unleashed on this stage was breathtaking. In the very back row, her mother Maria clutched a handkerchief in her hand, tears streaming silently down her face. They were not tears of sadness, but of overwhelming, explosive pride. This was her daughter. This was the girl she had raised on love and sacrifices. This was her music. And in the front, Isabella's world was falling apart. The smirk had vanished from her face the second Ilara's fingers hit the keys. At first, she was just annoyed by the loud start. But as the music grew, her expression changed. Her eyes widened in disbelief. She looked at her friends, but they weren't looking at her. Their mouths were slightly open, their eyes fixed on the stage. The music was breaking through all her defenses, all her prejudice. It was speaking a language she didn't know but understood perfectly. It was the sound of passion, of pain, of a power she could never comprehend. For the first time in her life, Isabella Vance felt small. Ilara played on, lost in the music. She was no longer thinking or feeling fear. She was just a channel for the sound. Her body swayed with the melody, her dark hair flying around her as she poured every ounce of her being into the final, breathtaking cascade of notes. The music built to a furious, powerful climax, a final, defiant shout against the silence, and then silence. She played the final chord, and it hung in the air of the grand hall, vibrating with an intensity that was almost physical. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. No one spoke. The entire audience was frozen in a state of stunned silence, held captive by the echo of the music they had just witnessed. It was the ultimate compliment, a silence more profound than any applause. Then a single person in the back row began to clap. It was Mr. Harrison. Another person joined in. Then another. Suddenly, like a dam breaking, the silence was shattered by a thunderous roar. The entire hall erupted. People were on their feet, clapping, shouting "Brava!" The sound was a physical force, a wave of validation and awe that washed over the stage. Ilara opened her eyes, her chest heaving. She looked out at the sea of standing people, a blur of faces and applause. Her eyes scanned the crowd and found her mother in the back, her face wet with tears but beaming with a smile so bright it could have lit up the whole hall. In that moment, the dress, the status, the fear, it all melted away. She was not the maid's daughter. She was not the girl in the rags. She was Ilara, and she was a musician. And the whole world was finally listening. The thunderous applause felt like a dream, a warm, roaring wave that she was floating on. Ilara stood up from the piano bench, her legs feeling strangely unsteady, as if the music had taken all the strength from her body and left only a humming, vibrating shell. The lights were blinding, turning the sea of people into a faceless, cheering blur. She gave a small, awkward bow, her mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. Then she turned and walked off the stage, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Backstage, the air was electric. A few of the other contestants, the ones who had looked right through her before, now stared with a mixture of shock and grudging respect. A girl with a violin gave her a hesitant smile. "That was, incredible," she said, her voice full of genuine awe. Ilara just nodded, not sure what to say. She felt a gentle hand on her shoulder and turned to see Mr. Harrison, his eyes shining with a pride so deep it seemed to light up his whole face. He didn't say anything. He just squeezed her shoulder, a simple gesture that meant more than any speech could. Then she saw her. Her mother, Maria, was pushing through the small crowd, her eyes locked on Ilara. She had gotten past the ushers, her usual quiet deference forgotten in a surge of maternal instinct. When she reached her daughter, she didn't say a word. She just wrapped her arms around her, pulling her into a hug so tight Ilara could barely breathe. Ilara buried her face in her mother's shoulder, smelling the familiar, comforting scent of soap and bleach that she had once been so ashamed of. Now it smelled like home. It smelled like love. She felt her mother's shoulders shaking and realized she was crying. And then she was crying too, silent, happy tears that washed away years of fear and loneliness. They stood there for a long time, two figures in a simple navy dress and a cleaner's uniform, holding each other in the middle of a world that had suddenly decided to notice them. The awards ceremony was a blur. Ilara stood on the stage with the other contestants, her mind still replaying the feeling of the keys under her fingers. The host came out to announce the results, building the tension with a long, dramatic speech. He spoke of artistry, of passion, of finding a voice that speaks to the soul. Ilara barely heard him. She was just thinking about the ride home, about the quiet moments she and her mother would share, about the look on Mr. Harrison's face. Winning didn't seem to matter anymore. She had already won. "And the winner of this year's Young Virtuoso Showcase," the host said, his voice booming through the hall, "and the recipient of a full scholarship to the prestigious Northwood Conservatory summer program, is Ilara from Northwood Academy." The sound that erupted from the crowd was even louder than before. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated joy. For a second, Ilara didn't move. She just stood there, stunned. Mr. Harrison was beaming from the wings, giving her a thumbs up. Her mother was in the back, her hands pressed to her mouth, tears flowing freely. And then she saw Isabella. The other girl was staring at her, her face a mask of complete and utter disbelief. It wasn't anger or jealousy, at least not yet. It was something deeper. It was the look of someone whose entire understanding of the world had just been proven wrong. The girl in the second-hand dress, the maid's daughter, was the winner. It was a truth that was too big for her to process. Elara walked slowly to the center of the stage to accept the large, gleaming trophy. It was heavy in her hands, a solid, real weight. She looked out at the standing, cheering audience and found her mother's face one last time. She raised the trophy slightly, a silent offering to the woman who had given her everything. The ride home in their old, reliable car was quiet. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a warm, peaceful glow in its place. The trophy sat on the back seat, wrapped carefully in a blanket. Ilara's mother kept glancing at it in the rearview mirror, a small, wonder-struck smile on her face. "A conservatory program," Maria said softly. More to herself than to Ilara, a real one. "It's just a summer program." "Mom," Ilara replied, though she knew it was so much more than that. "No. Mi amor," her mother said, her voice firm but gentle. "It's a door. You just opened a door that they all said was locked for people like us." She reached over and took Ilara's hand, her rough, work-worn fingers lacing through her daughter's. "I am so proud of you. Not for the trophy. Not for the scholarship. I'm proud of you because you never let them take your music away." Monday morning at Northwood Academy was like stepping into an alternate reality. The moment Ilara walked through the front doors, she felt the change. The whispers that followed her were no longer sharp and cruel. They were soft, filled with a new kind of energy. Students who had never even made eye contact with her before now gave her small, shy smiles. A girl from her history class stopped her in the hall. "Hey, I was at the showcase on Saturday," she said. "You were amazing, seriously." Ilara, taken by surprise, could only manage a quiet, "Thank you." She was no longer a ghost. She was a presence. It was strange and a little overwhelming. She still felt like the same girl, but the mirror the school held up to her was suddenly showing a different reflection. As she walked toward her locker, she saw her. Isabella was standing with her friends, but their usual circle of confident energy was gone. They were talking in low voices, and when they saw Ilara, they fell silent. Isabella's friends looked away, suddenly fascinated by the posters on the wall. But Isabella didn't. She watched Ilara approach, her expression unreadable. Ilara steeled herself, expecting a sarcastic comment or a cold stare. She was ready for it. But as she got closer, Isabella stepped away from her friends, blocking her path. There was no malice on her face, no arrogance. There was only a quiet, bewildered humility. "Hi," Isabella said, her voice barely a whisper. Ilara just looked at her, waiting. I didn't know," Isabella stammered, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I mean, I heard you play and, I'm sorry." The apology was so unexpected, so raw, that it disarmed Ilara completely. All the anger, all the hurt she had stored up for years, suddenly felt pointless. Vengeance would have been easy. But this quiet confession was something else entirely. It was the sound of a wall crumbling. Ilara didn't know what to say. She didn't want to gloat. She didn't want to make Isabella feel smaller than she already did. So she just looked at the girl who had made her life so miserable and gave a small, slow nod. It wasn't forgiveness and it wasn't acceptance. It was just an acknowledgement, a quiet closing of a chapter. Then she continued to her locker, leaving Isabella standing alone in the crowded hallway. That afternoon, Ilara didn't go straight to the bus stop. She walked down the quiet, familiar corridor to the chapel. She pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside. The light was just as she remembered it, painting colorful patterns on the pews. The old grand piano sat waiting for her. But something was different. This time she didn't close the door all the way. She left it slightly ajar, letting a sliver of the outside world into her sanctuary. Mr. Harrison was there, sitting on one of the pews, looking over some papers. He looked up and smiled as she entered. "There you are," he said. "I was just looking at the details for the summer program. It's quite intensive. They have you working with some of the best professors in the country." Ilara sat down on the piano bench, her fingers tracing the familiar, worn keys. "It's scary," she admitted. "It's supposed to be," he said kindly. "But you're not the same girl who was scared of a little competition. You've told your truth now. The rest is just practice." She smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached her eyes. She looked at the open door, then back at the piano. She was no longer the invisible girl hiding in a dusty room. She was Ilara the musician, the girl who had a voice. And as she began to play, the melody that filled the chapel was no longer a secret. It was a new song, full of hope and the bright promise of a future that was finally hers to write.